The fifth session of the 2021 Ohio Beef Cattle Management School was hosted via Zoom by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on February 15th. During that fifth session, the focus turned to managing reproductive efficiencies in the beef herd, including discussion on the economic significance of confirming pregnancy in beef cows and the various diagnostic methods that are available to do so. Listen in as OSU Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff introduces Extension Educator Al Gahler and his presentation on preg checking beef cows.
And we're going to kind of transition into another topic that was originally supposed to be a demonstration in preg checking, go over some different strategies and approaches to that. And I guess if we had a theme for tonight and last week's meeting, it's don't have open cows. So Al, want to take it away and tell us how to check for, make sure we don't have open cows?
So yeah, we're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about pregnancy checking for beef cows, and a little bit of an outline on what we're going to go through here is just to talk about, is it necessary? I could make this a real quick 2-minute presentation and just say, yes, everybody needs to preg check your cows, and you can either ultrasound, palpate, or blood test them and show you quick costs. But I want to really try to get you a good background and understanding on it, and really get into some of the things about why it is necessary and an important tool in our toolbox. And Garth is throwing a poll up there for us, just basically out of curiosity to get some thoughts on those of you out there paying attention here, to see who is or what your thoughts are on pregnancy testing. Is it a necessary step in our beef cow production aspect of our farm? So go ahead and answer that if you would. And then as we move through the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about things to help you understand why it might be necessary, and including fertility traits and how that portrays into the profitability of our operation, as well as some of the economics behind that and the costs associated with pregnancy checking with the different options and methods that we're going to show you. And then I'll give you some final thoughts and conclusions. So we do have a few people on here that, as you can see the results of the poll, say that it's not necessary to preg check our cows. And a majority though, however, that say that it is necessary. And we'll get another poll question here. And this one, the next poll question, has to do with the breeding period and the subsequent calving window that we might have with our cattle operations. And that's one that'll also kind of help us relate to, is pregnancy checking necessary? And what I ask when we look at that question of, is pregnancy checking necessary, that turns it into another question for me. And that is being profitable in your beef cow calf enterprise necessary? If not being profitable is not a necessary aspect of your beef cattle part of your farm, then maybe preg checking is not. But if you do want to be profitable, we're going to show you here in the next few slides how more than likely pregnancy checking is necessary. Before we move on to that though, just want to see, what is that typical calving period on all of your operations? Do you strive to get to that 60 to 90 days? Is it a little bit longer than that? Or in some cases, I know there are operations that just simply leave a bull in the pasture, and those cows can get bred any time of year and calves come any time of year. You can see majority, 70% of our people listening have that 60 to 90 day window, a few with a little bit longer. And we do have 7% of our listeners that have a 365 day calving window. And I understand sometimes facilities and other management procedures and how many cows we have and so forth may have a factor in that. But hopefully you'll get a good understanding as we get through here as to why we might want to more highly consider not only narrowing that calving window and the breeding time frame, but to doing pregnancy checking as well. One of the things to think about is, when is that cow due? As we, as producers, hopefully try to manage to the best of our abilities a big part of that can be understanding and knowing when those cattle are going to be calving. Is she going to be due next week when we have bad weather coming, or today when we have bad weather coming? If we had done proper pregnancy checking, we would have a pretty good idea. We may not have it down to the day, but we should be within a week or 10 days or half of that cycle, the estrus cycle, to know when that cow is going to calve. And pregnancy checking can help us to figure that. We certainly can't plan for the weather when we're breeding that cow, but it will help us to know what we can do to prepare for bad weather coming, knowing that we have due dates in the next few weeks. It can help us with our feed resources as well. Trying to lay out our feed resources to match the time of year and the productive cycle of that cow. If we know we've got a majority of our cows due in March, we might save some of our better feed for that late February, March, early April when we're feeding stored feeds. And having a simple pregnancy test done can help us really lay out what we're going to do in terms of those resources. The calving interval and the return to estrus, we need to think about this. If we leave a cow open for the entire year, even whether we know it or not, she is going to have hopefully still be cycling if she's a reproductive cow, and we're going to have management considerations with that. That cow will have other cows mounting her on probably a 21-day basis if she's on a normal cycle. And that can lead to facility problems or injuries to other cows if we have her running the entire year and cycling constantly. We can also have facility challenges with that. Marketing strategies as well. If we know when our cows are going to be calving and we can try to narrow that window of that calving, we can do a much better job of marketing contemporary groups of calves that are consistent size at weaning or whenever that marketing period may be. And we can also hopefully narrow that window of returning those cows to estrus to get them to breed better. A lot of different factors that can come into play when we consider why we might want to know when those calves are coming and utilize pregnancy testing. Another thing to look at is being profitable necessary in your operation. All of your cows are employees on your farm. And I understand that there are operations out there with kids having 4-H projects, and we just keep a couple heifers around and decide to try to have calves. It may not be a full-time farmer. It may not even be necessarily a part-time farmer. It might be a little bit more of a hobby where those cows are not looked at as employees. But in the general sense, if we're looking at the commercial cattlemen in Ohio or anywhere, those cows are definitely employees of your farm. And here's the neat thing about having cows as employees of your farm is you have the opportunity to create all the labor laws for your employees. There's no unions to bargain with, and there's no executive orders that can come down other than from you. So if you make those cows a good employee and they do their job and give you something that you can make a sale off of, then they can stick around. If they do not produce you a calf, they are not doing their job. And no income equals no way for you to make payroll on that cow. So if we look at it in that sense, this is one pretty good argument right here that pregnancy checking is a necessary tool on our farms. Another thing to look at is heritability of traits in beef cattle. And I know you had some discussion last week with John Grimes on EPDs and genetics, and Dean even got into a few things today on heritability. If you look at this chart, you'll see on the top line right here that fertility is not one of the most highly heritable traits when we compare it to some of the other things we normally look at, especially when studying EPDs for bull or cow selection. Some of these other traits have a much higher heritability factor or estimate, but it is still heritable. Fertility is heritable. And you saw on Dean's slides that scrotal circumference, which we relate directly to fertility, is a highly heritable trait. So it's something that we still want to consider if we are not pregnancy checking and we are keeping open cows around, or we're keeping cows that, well, she was just outside of my 90-day breeding window. It only took her another 10 days and I didn't get the bull pulled out. So we're going to keep her. And then you decide to keep heifers out of that cow. We may be doing long-term damage to the overall fertility in our herd. So just one more angle to think about in that discussion of whether we do or don't pregnancy test on our operation. And then, of course, the big one to look at, economics. How much does it cost to keep that open cow throughout the year? Because essentially, if you keep her for until the next breeding season, if we have a defined breeding season and we're going to keep her until that next breeding season comes around, that means she's gone a full 365 days without producing any income for us. She is not working for us, even though she's part of our labor force. Annual maintenance costs are going to range on the typical Ohio farm. And this just includes feed, mineral, vaccines, bedding, normal fixed costs that you would think about from anywhere from $400 to $700. And in some cases, depending on how many days on pasture versus how many days of stored feed, which can drastically differentiate some farms in Ohio, we could be upwards of $700 on those costs. And then management costs that could be more variable, such as labor, supplies, medicines, interest on an operating loan, as well as breeding costs. If we're doing artificial insemination, we could have another 100 to 300 in that cow pretty easily, as well as thinking about long-term health concerns. If that cow does go through the entire calendar year cycling, she could develop cysts. What's it going to do to her body condition? She's not going through reproductive performance, so she's still going to be eating the high quality feeds at times of birth and lactation when the other cows need that extra nutritional demand. And she could be building up quite a bit of fat and get into an excessive body condition score, which is, again, going to make her harder to breed and maybe not a cow that we want to have as part of that operation. Give you a little better look at this. If I can get the link to work and come up, we're going to take a closer look at some of those costs and show you another tool in our extension toolbox for you. And I think Garth's got another poll that he can throw up before I pull this slide out here. Just curious on what pregnancy checking methods are you currently using, as the very next slide after we look at this enterprise budget is going to get us into all these methods and what options we have for doing those pregnancy tests. So is your current preg check method to have a vet come out and do an ultrasound, to do palpation? Are you doing blood tests? Or are you just waiting to see if the 4th of July rolls around before that cow has her calf? So you can see that we do have quite a few that are using ultrasound, but we also have some, majority doing palpation, the tried and true standard method that many of us have used, and quite a few that are now doing blood tests as well. We're going to talk about each one of these procedures here in just a minute. Okay, so you've got the link right there in the slide that you guys saw, and you can very easily get to that by just going to farmoffice.osu.edu. And if you weren't aware of this tool that Extension has, there are enterprise budgets for almost any type of agricultural enterprise in Ohio. You can pull up budgets for your corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, swine, dairy, about anything you can think of that we produce in Ohio. And this particular budget that you're looking at is a spring calving cow herd based on 100 cows. This budget, as you can see at the top, is last updated in 2017, but I was pulling this up to look at today. I think most of these numbers are pretty accurate, but that's what's neat about these budgets is all the cells that are highlighted here, you can go in and change. So if you know that you're going to be marketing your calves at a higher weight than 550 pounds, where my cursor's at now, or you know you're going to get a bigger price, you can simply go in and change that. So if calves are worth $1.50 today, you can change that number to $1.50 and it will change the result over on the right-hand side. But if we just take a quick glance at this budget and look at, let's just say, I'm thinking we can probably get a bit more than $1.28 for those calves today. And if I enable that, I should be able to go in and make that change. You can see that changes our budget over here on this side, increases our total receipts where my cursor's at. And if we look down, we've got all these variable costs plugged in, days on pasture, hay, corn silage, whatever type of feed we're using, we can fill in and add all of our costs up and take a really close look at what we're doing in terms of the budget. And then we've got other factors figured in for fixed costs too, such as labor charges, replacement cost of cows, interest, equipment charges. And I know a lot of times individuals don't like to look at labor. Well, that I would own that tractor anyway for my row crop enterprise, so I don't need to charge my cow calf enterprise anything for the cost of that. But we look at all that in these budgets, which gives us a really good snapshot of where we're at. And if you scroll down to the bottom, then just looking at the normal production budget on average figures, we can see that we can pretty easily at $1.50 on that 550-pound calf clear costs. That's assuming that we have pasture rental values at $50 an acre. Hay is only costing us $125 a ton, which I would suspect we're looking at more than that in a lot of cases if you're buying your hay this year, but we can probably produce it for that. We can clear $441 above variable cost, but if we put in the total cost and add those fixed costs in, we're in a losing proposition. So really looking at the cost of an open cow for a year with no income from that calf, we not only have a net loss already, but we can add all those feed costs on top of that as well. Now, if we remove the labor and management portion, we're still looking at a profitable situation, but not if we run that open cow for the entire year. So I would encourage you all to take a look at those budgets and try to utilize those for every enterprise on your farm. And it's really neat to see what you can do by changing those cells around and getting a good look at your detailed numbers for all of your input costs as well as your receipts. So hopefully we've made a good case that you should in fact be pregnancy checking your cows in your operation. Even if you are a hobby farmer or just have 4-H projects for your kids, that's still a cost. And we should be teaching those kids the real side of the business and what it means to be trying to make a profitable scenario out of production livestock. And if we're going to do that, then pregnancy checking and not keeping those open cows around should be part of that scenario. So what can we do in terms of pregnancy checking? Well, you already heard me mention them. We've got palpation, we've got ultrasound, we can do blood testing and send those samples off to a laboratory. But I know there's some, and I didn't have this in the poll for you to answer as one of your types of pregnancy checking, but I do know there are producers out there who firmly believe they can look at a cow and tell whether she is pregnant. Just like we see everybody posting their pictures on Facebook of their baby bump when we have friends that are pregnant and expecting their first child or even second or third child. And there are producers out there. And I have had some producers even say to me and heard it several times that you can just tell by the look in their eye, they just have a different look to them. And I certainly hope that this is not one of your methods of pregnancy checking. And I'm sure, Stan, as you're listening, we mentioned when I taught a session a few weeks ago about several producers from my old days in Fairfield County being on the board and listening to our segment. This is a true word for word quote that I had. And Stan was standing right by my side 20 years ago at this particular farm when we were having the same discussion about why it was important in a commercial operation to be preg checking your cows. And that cattleman looked right at us and said, you can just kind of tell by looking at her rib shape. Now, certainly maybe you can when they're 7 months along and no longer fit through the alleyway very well. But to just come out and say that, we just kind of got a chuckle out of that. And we will leave that guy nameless, Stan, although I'm sure you can think of who that may have been. But not exactly the type of pregnancy checking that we're going to advertise. And here's just another little example to show you that. I'm sure many of you remember this classic movie that Tommy Boy said, you can get a good look at that T-bone by sticking your head in a particular place on the body of that bull or steer. But wouldn't you just rather take the butcher's word for it? And we can learn a lot from Tommy Boy. There's a lot of good life lessons in that movie. And this is one of those. We don't need to stick our head, but we can have a experienced veterinarian stick their arm up there and we can take his word for it as to whether that cow is pregnant or not. And not to knock on any new or younger veterinarians coming out, but there is some benefit to having an experienced veterinarian that has palpated several cows. I would like to think that any veterinarian would be able to give us accuracy out beyond that 45 or 50-day window to say pregnant or not pregnant, but an experienced veterinarian can tell us how far along within a certain window that pregnancy is. A good veterinarian can tell us as early as 35 days whether that cow is bred. And as long as we're in that 35 to 100 day window, that veterinarian can usually give us an approximate calving date. So if we have good records of either when we AI'd or if we synchronized and turned out with a bull, that veterinarian can go off of those dates and tell us whether he thinks that cow bred on the first cycle, second cycle, or third cycle, and so on, as long as we get him or her out there before we've passed 100 days of pregnancy. Beyond that, it gets rather difficult for them to tell exactly how big that fetus is and where we are in that production cycle. Some disadvantages, though, do occur with palpation, especially if we get in the case of an inexperienced veterinarian palpating those cows. We have to use our hand to feel down through the rectal wall, get a hold of the cervix and manipulate down to find that uterine horn and either feel the ovary or feel right in this area where that developing fetus is going to be. And an inexperienced veterinarian may have difficulty finding that and may have to just muck around in there a little bit more. We could potentially even cause abortions and kill that fetus without an experienced hand. It's also possible to cause injury to the cow if an inexperienced hand is in there just feeling around and doesn't know exactly what they're feeling for or having difficulty. And then the final one that's probably the biggest disadvantage here that we need to think about is we can spread disease. Typically, when we have a vet out to preg check, they're going to stand there and want to just put one sleeve on and you keep rolling the cows through. And no disrespect to any of those veterinarians, but sleeves are very inexpensive. And what I do at my farm is I provide the sleeves so that there's no question. I just ask the veterinarian, we're going to change sleeves between every cow. Here's the box of them. It's not going to cost you a dime. It's just going to take you an extra 5 seconds to put a new sleeve on for each one, because there are a lot of diseases that can be very easily transmitted through the palpation process. And that's something that we can very easily eliminate with a cost of just a few cents for an extra sleeve for each cow. Another option we have for preg checking is the ultrasound machine. And there's still some invasiveness on the cow with this procedure, but not quite as bad and less stress on both the cow and on her uterus because the vet does not have to put their arm in as far. You can see in the picture here, they're going to insert that probe in. And then in this particular case, this doctor has a headset where he's viewing that ultrasound screen right on that headset. There's also ones that will strap onto their hip that they can look at, or a monitor that has to be set up on the table chute side that they can look at. And very similar to the ultrasound procedure that you see in humans, where everybody posts those pictures on Facebook of that first ultrasound to tell that they're pregnant. Same scenario here. But what's neat about ultrasound is if we're looking for much more detailed, or if we need to get in there earlier in cases of intense AI and embryo production, good ultrasound technicians can detect pregnancy as early as 21 days post-breeding. And they can also tell us things depending on the stage of pregnancy, things such as the viability of the fetus. They can indicate if there might be twins in there. And in the case of getting in there and ultrasounding somewhere in around that 50 to 90 days of pregnancy window, we can even have them sex that pregnancy so that we know whether we're expecting a bull or a heifer calf. Some disadvantages though with ultrasound, obviously the veterinarian is going to have the cost of that equipment and they're going to pass that cost on to you, the producer. So it is going to be more expensive. Typically not a lot more expensive than palpation, but there is typically more cost associated with it. And we'll have some more information on that here in a few minutes. It may require a better facility. And of course, even with palpation or blood draws that we're going to talk about next, we have to have proper facilities so that we can ensure the safety of the cow and the handlers and the veterinarians. But it may require just a little bit better setup with possibly electric. We need to be out of the weather for the ultrasound machine. Just a little bit more there for the veterinarian to be comfortable using his ultrasound machine. And we've got to have proper handling facility as well to make sure that the cows are going to be contained. Just pinching them between a gate and tying them off with the halter is probably not going to get any veterinarian excited about getting their ultrasound machine out. And then one of the other downfalls, even though we can get in and detect much earlier, as early as 21 days with ultrasound, getting inside of that cow, and we still do have that risk of aborting a fetus early on. Or if we have cows that for some other reason, their body decides that that is not a good pregnancy and they abort or absorb that fetus and come back into heat later, especially in the case of us doing AI, thinking we have an AI pregnancy, and then we turn her out with the bull and we're not actively watching, we don't know that she came back in heat. We could be expecting an AI calf, but in reality, she absorbed that fetus and she could be 1, 2, even 3 cycles later when that calf actually comes, which could get us nervous if we're overdue on an AI or an embryo calf. Now we'll move on to talking about the blood testing. I know several of you indicated on the poll that you are doing blood testing, and this is some of the advantages here are, again, we can get pretty early results on heifers that have not had a calf before. We can start pulling blood to do preg checking at 25 days post-breeding. On cows, 28 days post-breeding, but as you'll see on the next slide, they also need to be 60 to 73 days post-calving so that we don't get faulty readings on the proteins that they are evaluating. On blood testing, we also obviously have less stress on the uterus and on the cow because it's not invasive. All we need to do is pull blood on the cow and send it off. There is no palpation involved, so definitely easier on her. It's very low cost, and we'll get into those costs here in just a minute as we compare. This one only requires the farmer or the producer. We do not have to have a veterinarian present to pull blood and send it off for sampling. Of course, you can involve your veterinarian if you're not comfortable pulling those samples, but more than likely, if you're not comfortable doing it yourself, you can find someone else, a neighbor or someone else close by in the business that would be comfortable pulling that blood. This procedure can be very helpful in AI and embryo programs because we can collect that sample exactly 25 or 28 days after we breed and send it off and know right away whether we have that AI or that embryo conception. It's a highly accurate process at any stage of pregnancy, whether we're looking at 28 days or whether we're looking at 198 days, a highly accurate procedure. And it can also at some labs be combined with other testing on the same sample. So you can eliminate a little bit of expense and in some cases get BVD testing done off of that same sample. What are the disadvantages of blood testing for preg checking? Well, for one, like I already mentioned, the cow has to be between 60 and 73 days post-calving, depending on which type of blood test we're going to use. And the reason for that is because they're measuring levels of proteins in the blood to detect that pregnancy that are produced by the uterus in the cow at the time of pregnancy. And they have to have high enough levels to indicate that pregnancy, but there will be residual levels from a prior pregnancy in that cow even after she calved. So if we have that super cow that's in heat 28 days after she calved and we breed her and want to test that one 28 days later, we're only 56 days postpartum. She's likely going to show us a positive on that test, whether she truly is bred again or not, because she has residual proteins in her blood system from that prior pregnancy. But on a normal 365-day calving interval, we are going to be past that 73-day post-calving mark anyway, so we can still hopefully have good results with our AI and embryo programs. One of the other disadvantages here is we cannot determine the stage of pregnancy. We are simply going to get a yes or no, or in some cases a recheck, where the levels that they're reading with these tests will tell us that the pregnancy is definitely safe, or that it's not safe, or we have a range in the middle, as you're going to see on one of our results pages here, that they might ask you to recheck because they don't know for sure based on a mild level of the proteins whether that cow can safely be called pregnant. Early detected pregnancies, again, can be absorbed or aborted by the cow. And this does happen from time to time for reasons that we may never understand or may never even know. So if we do preg check a cow at 28 days and we have that blood sample, we all of a sudden mark that cow down as bred. We don't watch her anymore. We turn her out with a bull and something happens and she cycles 2 days later, again, we're in that same scenario where we might be expecting a calf way earlier than it's actually coming if she did in fact absorb it and cycle again later. Results are not instant. When we have our veterinarian shoot side, they're telling us right away whether that cow's bred and how far along. With the blood samples, obviously we have to package those samples, send them to a lab, and it's going to take a few days for it to arrive, as well as give them a couple days to run the test. So typically most labs are going to have those results back to you within 1 or 2 business days of when they receive it. So about a week timeline altogether to get those results back. And because of that reason, I don't consider the blood testing ideal for the commercial producer who just wants to do 1 round of pregnancy checking and make calling decisions based on that. Because if we do have, for some reason, a false positive or a false negative, and we only did 1 round of blood testing and no palpation, we might call a bred cow, or we could possibly be keeping an open cow if we did something in error on any of that testing, or we tested too early before she was 73 days post calving, or something else that came up. There is that small chance of a false reading. So I don't advise this one if we're just going to do a one-time calling decision based on that 1 sample. What does it cost? What do we need to do this blood testing? Just a syringe and a needle. I typically use an 18 or 19 or 20 gauge needle. 1 inch or 3/4 inch is all you need. 3 cc syringe. And here's costs. The last time I ordered supplies, what it cost me, and then packaging and shipping, it's going to cost you a few bucks to put those blood tubes in a package that's not going to be damaged in shipping and send it to the lab. So depending on how many you send, that's going to make the per sample cost vary greatly. If you're sending 10 samples and it costs $8, obviously it's better than sending 1 sample for $8. But very low cost procedure here, especially the more samples we want to send. How does that blood work? The blood sampling work? How do they tell the pregnancies? Well, as I alluded to, they test for pregnancy specific proteins that are being produced and in the bloodstream of that animal. There are 2 different tests, one by Bioprint and one by Genex, called the DG29 test, that measure those proteins in the blood. And then they perform an ELISA test, which is used for many other procedures as well, to measure the optical density of those blood samples and compare it with known controlled values. And as you'll see on my next slide of a sample results page, those known values are going to give them a range then on those proteins that are contained in that sample, so that we know whether that level is indicating pregnant or open. And then another test from IDEX specifically looks for pregnancy associated glycoproteins, a different type of test in the blood serum. Again, using an ELISA reader though, that's just looking at the optical density and comparing it to controls for both open and known pregnant cows. And here's what a sample of those results are going to look like. You will get a reading here that'll tell you your animal ID number that you submitted. It'll tell you the actual reading from their ELISA test in this next column. And as you can see up at the top here, if a cow was less than 0.135 on her reading, they consider her open. If she was greater than 0.21, they considered her pregnant. And if she fell in somewhere in a middle gray area range here of 0.135 to 0.21, they considered recheck. And on this particular sample of these cows of mine, I had 2 that came back as recheck. And what I did, by the time you get these results, because it was already 5 or 6 days after I pulled the initial sample, if that cow is in fact pregnant, she would have enough higher protein levels just in those 5 or 6 days that she would more than likely test pregnant again. So I submitted those rechecks right away, and that would be the proper procedure there. Going to cost you a couple more bucks, but you'll have a definite positive answer, unless of course you've observed that cow in heat after the time that you submitted that initial sample. So pretty easy to read. You can get those results back by email or by fax, or you can ask them to give you a phone call and just read them to you over the phone to see. But there is that possibility of having that recheck zone. And you can see I sampled all these cows at 28 days. And that might be part of the reason that the cows just didn't quite have enough of that protein in their system yet to be detected as actually pregnant. What about how to actually pull that blood sample? Some of you may be nervous about doing that. I know some people don't even like to give vaccines or do anything with needles. It's a pretty simple procedure though. If I can get this YouTube video to pop up, we're going to take 3 or 4 minutes here to watch Dr. Les Anderson, who many of you saw at our programs last winter when we had him come up from the University of Kentucky and do some talks on reproductive management. And we'll just watch this video to help you understand how easy it is to pull that blood sample and get that result.
My name is Dr. Les Anderson, and I'm a beef extension specialist at the University of Kentucky. The focus of this short video is to demonstrate how to take a blood sample from the tail or from the jugular vein in order to get that blood sample processed for pregnancy diagnosis. One of the new technologies that's emerged in the beef industry in the last 3 or 4 years is the ability of companies to run blood analysis to determine pregnancy in beef cattle. As long as the animal is at least 30 days pregnant and about 90 days from calving, the blood sampling can be very accurate, and can exceed 95% in its accuracy. It will not give you stage of gestation, but it will give you a very accurate record or recording of whether she is or is not pregnant. The materials you will need to take a blood sample are latex gloves, a 5 cc or 3 cc syringe, an 18 gauge 1-inch needle, and of course the sampling tubes. Typically, you will get your sampling tubes and your paperwork from the company that's going to analyze your blood samples. For instance, in Bowling Green, Kentucky, Gold Standard Labs analyzes blood samples for pregnancy for beef cattle producers. If you call that company, they will send you the paperwork, they will send you the blood tubes, and if you need, they will send you the needles and syringes to take the samples. Typically within a week of sending your blood samples, you will get that analysis back, and again, it's about 95% accurate. The first step in obtaining a tail blood sample is to put the needle on the syringe. Second, you'll get your paper towels, restrain your animal, and we'll get in behind the animal to take the blood sample. First, you take the paper towel and you'll clean the underside of the tail. Get it as clean as you can, and you'll take the tail and you'll bend it straight up. If you look at the anatomy of the underside of the tail head, you will see a groove that runs right in the middle, okay, and you can actually feel bone on both sides. Your goal with the tail sample is to go directly into that groove and perpendicular to the tail. About 3 milliliters is what's necessary to obtain a good sample for pregnancy determination. A couple of the keys, okay, to quick and accurate blood sampling. Number one, on that tail head, there's the groove. The needle must be perpendicular, not angled up, not angled down, not angled side to side, so that you can quickly penetrate the blood vessel, the vein that runs in that groove, and that you can draw the sample. Also, please use a new needle and new syringe for every sample. This prevents disease spreading. This also prevents contamination from one sample to the next. Once you've taken the sample, you'll take your tube that the sample will be sent to the company. You'll insert the needle, and the vacuum from the tube will evacuate the blood from the syringe. Make sure that the tube is accurately labeled with the sample number. So if this was the first animal that we did, it was sample number 1. With the cow's identification, this cow is Z24. So we will write sample 1, cow Z24. And then this is from the UK Research Center. So I would put some indication there that it's UK Animal Research Center, UKARC, something like that, so that the blood sampling company can accurately track which farm, which sample, and which cow.
I did post the link in the chat box that you can feel free to copy down and paste into your browser and watch that for those of you that may not have tried this technique yet. A really good video, and it is a really simple and easy procedure, even for someone with no experience at pulling blood to get those samples made. Where do we submit those samples to? This is really easy also. There's several different labs that you can choose from. I'm not going to make any recommendation onto what test might be better or worse or what lab to work with. That's all something that you can get from personal preference or talking to other producers and figuring out what one's going to work the best for you. There are a few different locations of labs in Ohio conducting these tests. That's pretty easy, and that will give you the shortest shipping time as well. One thing I do recommend, and I apologize to the federal government for this, but we do need to think about, especially if we're shipping within Ohio, UPS has 1-day ground service anywhere in the state to get that shipment to the lab. And I actually had a case where I shipped something. I have a fall calving herd of cows myself, so I'm breeding in November and December. I mailed some 2 days before Christmas, and they did not receive them until January 26th. And I was informed that they have about 30 days in which those proteins are good in that blood sample before they'll break down and not give accurate testing. So I lost out on my first round of blood sampling from my first round of fall preg checks. So just something to keep in mind. Normally, anytime that you do send it by post office, it's really convenient for me to do it that way. They have those flat rate boxes that are about $7 or $8 and are perfect size to ship a small quantity between 10 and 20 samples. Makes it really easy, and they provide tracking and insurance on it as well. So there is a good option there. Just want to give that some consideration when you send those samples off though. If you go to the website for any one of these different labs, you can get all the information you need. You can download the submission forms that you can fill out with all the information necessary for how you want them to report to you, as well as all the animal IDs and how many days they are bred. And then you'll get an email or a printout back similar to what I showed you a few slides back. As we start to conclude here on some generalizations, want to give you just a quick snapshot of overall costs and what it takes to perform pregnancy checking in your beef herd. Of course, if you are going to rely on that tried and true eye test, I will have to send you down to Fairfield County and see if Stan can train you on that eye test. And that procedure is free for you to perform on your own farm. There's no guarantee of your whole farm profitability if this is the procedure you choose to use, however. Blood testing, you'll have a range. Most of the labs charge somewhere around $3 per sample to run those blood tests. So then with the cost of your syringes, needles, and shipping and handling, you're going to range, if you were to send roughly 10 samples off, somewhere in that $4 to $5 range. If you're only sending one or two, maybe as high as $6 per test. Palpation is going to vary depending on how close your vet is to you. In most cases, most veterinarians that I've talked to around here to get some ideas on this are going to be in the range of anywhere from $3 to $10 per cow for palpation. And then they're going to have what most vets do for large animal calls as well, is either mileage or an hourly driving rate, or just an hourly rate for the entire procedure from when they leave their office till they get to your farm and until they complete their procedures. But on average, that cost is going to come out to somewhere around $10 to $15 in most cases per cow. Could be as high as $25 if you're significant travel distance from that vet's office because of the travel charges or the farm call fee. If we go to ultrasound, some vets have very little difference between ultrasound or palpation. Some charge just a few dollars more. Again, for the palpation or the ultrasound itself, you're usually looking at somewhere in that $5 to $10 per cow, plus the farm call fees from the vet, which will give us an overall cost anywhere from $10 to $35, depending on how many cows we're going to be preg checking. We compare that to the cost of keeping that open cow for a year. As you go back to looking at that enterprise budget, you saw that we could have feed costs anywhere from $300 to as much as $700 a year in keeping that cow, not to mention any of those costs that she could be putting into our herd because of additional management considerations. So definitely a lot cheaper. And when we really step back and look at that, if we had the extreme situation, like my first bullet point shows here, of $800 a year of an annual cost for that cow, we could pay for 16 pregnancy tests, even if they cost us $25 per head. That would meet the minimum cost of keeping an open cow for a year. And another interesting coincidence there, we could pay for 16 pregnancy tests versus the cost of one open cow. The average herd size in Ohio is 16 to 17 cows. I know some of you are much larger, some of you are much smaller than that, but on the average, that just goes to show right there, one open cow can pay more than pay for, in most cases, pregnancy testing of our entire herd. So with that, just want to leave you with a couple more closing thoughts, that pregnancy checking should definitely be an essential tool that you're pulling out of your toolbox as a cow-calf manager that we simply cannot afford to ignore. And when we go back and look at all the decisions and factors that go into this, if we really want to look at that profitability, and this will be a great lead-in for the talk you're going to hear from Dean Krager next week on culling considerations in our herd, there should be no sacred cows because of pregnancy. There may be sacred cows for other reasons, but if we're really trying to get on top of whole farm profitability, there are no free passes for cows that cannot do their job and get pregnant on an annual basis and deliver us a live calf. And as one of my former colleagues quoted in a cow-calf school that we did several years ago back in Fairfield County, he encouraged the entire audience, and some of you may remember this, to love your kids, but manage your cows. I know there's a lot of people out there that do in fact love those cows, especially the prized 4-H heifer that is a part of the herd, and we keep her around way too long and give her way too many free passes in some cases. So we need to manage her and spend your time on loving those kids to make sure that your farm is profitable, and pregnancy checking is not one of those things that's putting you in the red.